In the early years of the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He had risen from the turmoil of the French Revolution, first as a brilliant general, then as the master of France, and finally as Emperor of the French. In less than a decade, he had defeated almost every great power in Europe, Austria, Prussia, and even Russia, leaving Britain as his only consistent enemy. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland had seemed to prove that no army could withstand him. By 1807, much of the continent was under his control or bound to him by alliance. It was after Friedland that Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, where they signed the Treaty of Tilsit. The image was powerful. Two young rulers, dividing Europe between them, speaking as though they were destined to shape history together. On paper, Russia accepted Napoleon's supremacy in Western Europe and even joined his continental system, the Great Blockade designed to strangle Britain's trade. In return, Napoleon promised to let Russia expand its influence toward the east, but beneath the grand gestures and the smiles, there was distrust. Napoleon, always hungry for more, never truly saw Alexander as an equal. And Alexander, proud and ambitious, resented being treated as a junior partner. The alliance was a facade, and in the years that followed, cracks began to widen. For Russia, the continental system was a curse. The blockade hurt its economy, cutting off vital trade with Britain. Merchants complained, nobles grumbled, and Alexander himself grew restless. At the same time, Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw out of Polish lands, a move that alarmed Russia deeply. For Poland had long been under Russian influence and now stood as a French satellite right on its border. Tensions grew sharper still when Napoleon sought a marriage alliance with the Russian royal family and was refused. Instead, he turned to Austria, marrying the young Archduchess Maria Louise in 1810. To Alexander, this was a personal insult and a political threat. By 1811, the fragile friendship had collapsed. Alexander reopened Russian ports to British ships, openly defying Napoleon's system. To the French emperor, this was nothing less than betrayal. His pride wounded, his authority challenged, Napoleon resolved to act in the only way he knew: with war. He told his ministers that Russia must be brought back into line, that Alexander must be forced to bend, just as Austria and Prussia had before. And so the stage was set. From the heart of Europe, Napoleon began to assemble the greatest army the continent had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of men from France and its allies gathered for a campaign that many believed would be short, sharp, and glorious, like the lightning wars of the past. Few imagined the scale of suffering that was about to unfold. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was not born of a single cause. It was the product of pride, ambition, wounded honor, and economic conflict. It was a clash between two rulers who distrusted each other, two empires whose interests could no longer be reconciled. And as the spring of 1812 turned to summer, Europe held its breath. Napoleon was preparing to march east into a land vast, mysterious, and unforgiving. As the winter of 1811 gave way to spring, Napoleon's vision took shape. He was not preparing for just another war. He was preparing for a march that would astonish the world. The Grande Armée, as his soldiers were proudly called, swelled to a size that no one had ever seen before. Men poured in from every corner of his empire, French veterans who had marched with him since Italy and Egypt. Young recruits hungry for glory, and a multitude of allies bound to him by treaties or by fear. Poles, Germans, Italians, Swiss, Dutch, even reluctant Austrians all found themselves drawn into the greatest host Europe had ever known. When assembled, it numbered more than 500,000 souls, with endless columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery stretching farther than the eye could see. It was a magnificent sight, but also a monstrous burden, to feed so many mouths, to water so many horses, to keep them clothed and armed. It was a task that would have tested even the most advanced states. Napoleon believed that speed would solve the problem, that the campaign would be decided in weeks, as his other wars had been. The land, he thought, would provide what his soldiers needed. But the land he was marching into would not give so easily. On the other side, Russia prepared in silence. The Tsar's army was smaller, barely half the size of Napoleon's at the beginning, but it had something the Grande Army did not: patience and an endless depth of space. The Russian generals knew they could not meet Napoleon in the kind of open, decisive battle that had destroyed Austria at Austerlitz and Prussia. At Jena, instead, they planned to retreat, to burn, to bleed the invaders, little by little. Behind their lines stretched the vastness of Russia, forests, rivers, and plains that seemed to go on forever. Every step Napoleon took forward would carry him deeper into a land that was harsh, hostile, and empty. Yet before a single musket was fired, hardship already began. The sheer movement of such a gigantic army strained every road, every supply depot, every river crossing. Soldiers went hungry. Horses fell dead on the march. Disease crept through the ranks. Still, the soldiers pressed on, carried by the legend of their emperor, convinced that one great battle would bring them plunder, honor, and the end of the war. Napoleon, too, was certain of his plan. He would cross the frontier, strike hard, force the Russians to fight, and win as he always had. But the Russians did not intend to give him that chance. They had decided on a crueler, colder strategy. They would yield the land, destroy their own villages and crops, and lure the invaders farther and farther east. So it was that in the summer of 1812, as the rivers swelled with meltwater and the fields turned green, Europe braced itself for a campaign that promised both grandeur and horror. Napoleon had gathered the mightiest army the world had ever seen, and Russia prepared to receive it with fire and silence. The two giants stood facing one another across the Niemen River. The march of destiny was about to begin. On a warm morning in late June 1812, the silence of the Niemen River was broken. Drums rolled, trumpets sounded, and the first columns of the Grande Army began to cross. The riverbank shook beneath the weight of men and horses, cannon and wagons. Napoleon himself watched, solemn and determined, convinced that he was writing the opening lines of another triumph. To his soldiers, it felt like destiny. They were marching east, to humble the mighty empire of the Tsars. Yet almost immediately, the dream of a swift campaign began to unravel. The army moved too slowly, stretched out over miles of road. The heat was suffocating. Dust hung thick in the air, and men collapsed beneath the sun. Food ran short, wells dried up. Horses, the lifeblood of Napoleon's cavalry and artillery, dropped dead in their tracers. Disease spread like a shadowed dysentery, fever, the invisible enemies of every soldier. Within weeks, tens of thousands had fallen, and still no great battle had been fought. The Russians had vanished. Instead of standing to fight, they retreated deeper into their homeland, and as they withdrew, they burned. Villages smoldered, fields were stripped bare, granaries put to the torch. What the French soldiers found was silence and ash. They marched hungry, searching desperately for supplies, but the land offered nothing. For Napoleon, this was maddening. He had built his career on speed and decisive victories. Every mile he advanced, he expected the Russians to turn and fight. Every day they refused, slipping away into the east. At Smolensk, in August, he finally thought he had them. The city was defended, and the French stormed it with all their fury. Cannons roared, walls crumbled, flames leapt high into the sky. When at last the French broke through, Smolensk was theirs, but it was a ruin, burning and empty. Its people fled or dead. The Russians had once again escaped, retreating in order, preserving their army. Napoleon had taken a city, but gained nothing. His men, starving and exhausted, looked around at the devastation and wondered what kind of victory this was. By September, the toll of the march was unbearable. Out of the immense force that had crossed the Niemen, perhaps a quarter was already going lost to hunger, disease, desertion, and endless skirmishes with Russian Cossacks who circled the columns like wolves, striking supply trains, harassing stragglers, and vanishing into the countryside. The French army, once a proud and glittering host, was already fraying at the edges, and yet hope still flickered. Moscow lay ahead, the sacred heart of Russia, the city of the Tsars. If Napoleon could take it, surely Alexander would yield. The men spoke of it with longing, a prize that might finally give meaning to their suffering. But before Moscow could be reached, the Russians at last turned to face them. On the plain near a village called Borodino, they dug in and prepared to fight. For the first time since the invasion began, the road was blocked. Napoleon would finally have his battle. The soldiers of the Grande Armée, weary but burning with anticipation, prepared themselves for the storm to come. The fate of the campaign, perhaps the fate of Europe itself, would soon be decided in a single terrible day. On the morning of September 7th, 1812, the fields of Borodino lay cloaked in mist. Thousands of campfires smouldered, drums beat softly in the dawn, and two vast armies faced one another across a narrow stretch of land. For weeks Napoleon had chased the Russians, and at last they had turned to fight. The soldiers of the Grande Armée stood weary, hollow-eyed from hunger and fatigue, but their spirits were lifted finally. Here was the battle they had longed for, the chance to end this dreadful march. Across the field, the Russian army waited, grimly defending the road to Moscow, defending their homeland. When the cannons opened, the earth itself seemed to tremble. French guns thundered, Russian guns answered, and soon the air was filled with smoke so thick that men fought half-blind, stumbling over the bodies of their comrades. The battle raged fiercest at the Bagration flèches, earthworks that changed. Hands again and again, soaked with blood. Men charged, bayonets flashing, only to be hurled back in chaos. The ground became a slaughterhouse. At the center stood the Raevski redoubt, a great fortress of earth and guns. The French hurled themselves against it all day, breaking through at terrible cost, then driven out, then returning once more. The cries of the wounded rose above the thunder of artillery. Whole regiments were shattered, yet still the fight went on, and through it all Napoleon watched. He held back his imperial guard, his finest, most loyal soldiers. He feared that committing them might overextend his line, that the Russians still had reserves hidden. Perhaps it was caution, perhaps it was fatigue. Whatever the reason, he never gave the order. Historians would forever ask whether that moment of hesitation cost him the campaign. By evening, the French stood bloodied but victorious. The Russians, though battered almost beyond recognition, had not been destroyed. Under cover of night, Kutuzov ordered a retreat. Once again, Napoleon had won a battle, but not the decisive triumph he needed. The price was staggering, more than 30,000 French casualties, and even greater losses for the Russians perhaps. 40,000 or more. Borodino was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a wound that bled both armies white. A week later, on September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. He had imagined a triumphant arrival, streets filled with supplicants, messengers from the Tsar begging for peace. Instead, the city was silent. Its people had fled. That night, fires broke out across the wooden quarters, flames leaping higher and higher until half the city was a sea of fire. Some said Russian patriots had lit the blazes. Others believed it was an accident. Whatever the cause, Moscow burned. Napoleon moved into the Kremlin, waiting. He believed that Alexander would now have no choice but to negotiate. Weeks passed. The Tsar sent no envoys, no letters, no offers. The silence was deafening. Outside the city, the countryside had been stripped bare. There was no food for his soldiers, no shelter against a coming cold. Inside Moscow, the soldiers looted what they could, but hunger and disease crept steadily through the ranks. What Napoleon had gained was not a victory, but a trap. He held the heart of Russia, yet it was an empty prize. Moscow was a ghost, a burned-out husk, offering nothing but ashes. And still the Russian will to fight remained unbroken. The Emperor of France had reached the height of his conquest and, with it, the edge of ruin. For more than a month, Napoleon lingered in Moscow, waiting for a peace that never came. Each day he expected a letter from Tsar Alexander, a messenger with terms, a sign that the war was over. But the silence was absolute. Alexander had sworn he would never negotiate while a single foreign soldier remained on Russian soil. And so, as the weeks slipped by, Napoleon's triumph curdled into despair. By mid-October, the truth could no longer be ignored. Winter was approaching. The Russian autumn rains had already turned the roads into seas of mud. Food was gone. Horses were dying by the thousands, too weak to pull the guns and wagons. The army was dwindling, and morale was breaking. At last, on October 19th, 1812, Napoleon gave the order to abandon Moscow. The Grande Armée began its long retreat west. At first, the weather was merciful, but the Russians were not. Kutuzov's army shadowed the retreat, striking the rearguard, sending the dreaded Cossacks to harass the stragglers and burn what little villages still stood. Every step was contested, every mile paid for in blood. The French soldiers, hungry and ragged, marched with eyes hollow and stomachs empty, knowing the long road home was filled with enemies. Then came the cold. In early November, snow began to fall. The temperature dropped, freezing rivers and turning the land white and merciless. The soldiers were unprepared, thin uniforms, worn boots, no shelter against the wind that cut like knives. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Men collapsed in the snow and never rose again. Entire units dissolved into shuffling crowds, barely able to carry their muskets. Discipline collapsed. Horses were slaughtered for food. Soldiers gnawed on scraps of leather, on bark torn from trees. Some froze standing up, leaning on their muskets, as though still marching. The Grande Armée, once a proud host, became a ghostly procession across the endless Russian plain. The retreat turned into a nightmare at the Berezina River in late November. The French reached the river only to find it blocked by Russian forces. For a moment, it seemed the entire army would be trapped, annihilated. In desperation, Napoleon's engineers built makeshift bridges out of scraps of wood and frozen beams. Under fire with chaos all around, the soldiers swarmed across. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic. But somehow a remnant of the army made it to the other side. By the time they staggered into friendly territory, the Grande Army was destroyed. Of the more than 500,000 men who had crossed the Niemen in June, fewer than 100,000 remained, many of them crippled, starving, broken. Regiments had ceased to exist. Whole nations had lost their sons. Napoleon himself rode ahead, leaving his shattered army behind, rushing back to Paris to preserve his throne. For the soldiers still on the road, there was only snow, silence, and death. The invasion of Russia had begun in glory, with banners flying and drums beating. It ended in a trail of corpses across a frozen land, a retreat that would haunt Europe for generations. When the survivors of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the frontier in December 1812, Europe gasped. The army that had once been the pride of France, the unstoppable force that had conquered half the continent, was no more. Out of more than 500,000 men who had marched into Russia, only a broken fraction returned. The rest lay buried in frozen fields, scattered across nameless villages, or simply vanished into the snow. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of the end. His aura of invincibility had been shattered. The kings and emperors of Europe, who had once trembled before him, now saw that he could be beaten not by a single battle, but by endurance, by patience, by a land and a people that refused to yield. Within a year, new coalitions rose against him. His enemies sensed weakness, and they struck. The Russian campaign became more than a military disaster. It became a legend, a symbol of hubris punished by fate. Napoleon had believed he could bend Russia to his will, as he had bent Austria, Prussia, and countless others. But Russia gave him no battlefield glory, no treaty of surrender, only silence, fire, and snow. For the soldiers who survived, the memories never faded. They spoke of the endless marches through burning villages, of the gnawing hunger of comrades who fell asleep in the snow and never woke again. They remembered Borodino, where the earth ran red, and Moscow, where the flames lit up the night sky. Above all, they remembered the cold, the merciless cold that seemed less like weather and more like an enemy of its own. And yet, in the tragedy of it all, there was a strange, terrible grandeur. The campaign of 1812 showed the world both the heights of human ambition and the depths of human suffering. It was a lesson written not in ink, but in blood and fire and frost. Napoleon would fight again at Leipzig. At Waterloo, he would never recover the strength he had lost in Russia. His empire would crumble, his crown would be taken, and he would die far from France, an exile on a lonely island. But the ghosts of 1812 remained. They still walk the roads of Russia, where once the drums of the Grande Armée beat proudly, and where, in the silence of the snow, those drums were silenced forever.